Trade, geopolitics, consumption, and innovation all influence China's economy. Policies, investments, industries, and financial dynamics form the intricate layers of this ever-evolving landscape. At China's Economy Analyzed, a key session at this year's Summer Davos, you will gain invaluable insights from industry practitioners and straight-shooting perspectives that keep you ahead of the curve.
The next China is actually still a lot of China.
Ones that are most protected from trade wars and geopolitical uncertainties are those that have their own IP, R&D, skill, upstream.
To make sure that both the short term and the long term look promising.
I'm bullish about China. I think it's a new era for new champions.
I think the fundamental is China is going to lead AR plus wave, not only for China, but for the whole world.
Join me for an in-depth discussion about the Chinese economy and be part of this global conversation on an ever-changing world. How much really geopolitics is having an impact on the nature and the immediate future of the Chinese economy? We've been hearing, great rivalry, or we've been hearing there are a lot of competitions, and also we have also seen antagonism signs here and there. But really, exactly how much it is having our impact, despite the narratives. Governor Zhu.
Well, geopolitical risk indeed has a big impact on economics, and not only for China, but for the whole world. First of all, if you're looking for the tariff, right, tariff upside down, and it really changes trade flows. It's very interesting. If you're looking for the China's exports to U.S. in April, actually dropped 21%. When you have a tariff of 145, tariff drops, and export growth become positive to 3.5. So indeed, the geopolitical risk really had the real impact on trade, on all the economic other issues as well. But more important is really the issue of uncertainty. We observed in the whole supply chain now, because the geopolitical uncertainties, the investment certainly stopped. Right? People just don't know, waiting to see. Because if you have a tariff would jump back and forth from 145 to whatever, right? A really difficulty for a business person to make a long-term decision. So investments are stalled, and the supply chain is repositioning. So where to go, how, is another big issue. So a lot of uncertainty from geopolitical risk areas also transform to real sectors. So I think that's the real things. Also, going further, the uncertainty also have an impact on the equity market.
Sure.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for the global equity market, it's really like a roller coaster, upside down, upside down all the time. For China, this time it's relatively stable, calm, because we learned from 2018 in the Trump 1.0 trade war. At that time, markets really bumping forward. So China this time prepare a quantitative easing macro policy at the floor to support confidence in the market. So markets are really stable, but the confidence shaking is really have an impact on the financial sector as well.
I see. Professor Prasad, despite of the narrative, we also see tremendous economic interdependence between China and the United States, while at the same time, there is leverage on both sides toward one another as well. So exactly how accurate is that narrative of antagonism, of rivalry only?
These are the two largest economies in the world, and they cannot sidestep each other. The question is whether they step on each other's toes or end up dancing with each other. And the latter prospect seems unlikely right now. But what we are learning from the outcomes of the negotiations we've seen between the two sides so far, it's not that either side possesses all the cards. Both sides can potentially inflict pain on each other. I think we would all like to be in a world where the two sides are collaborating and cooperating with each other, trying to think about what the choke points are. But the reality we face right now is that there is one critical element that is going to be very difficult to reconcile between the two countries. Trump has talked about reviving smokestack manufacturing in the US, but really, what we've seen from the Biden administration and so on is that the US wants a manufacturing revival in the new technology industries, electric vehicles, green energy, and so on. Now, the problem is that these are precisely the industries that China is counting on for its technological upgrading and moving up the value-added chain. And what we've seen in the progress of the negotiations is that there has been a whiplash in terms of which party seems to have the upper hand. Towards the beginning of the year, it looked like the US economy was in strong shape. China was floundering somewhat, and therefore the US had a stronger hand. That narrative has shifted. It is clear right now that the Chinese economy does seem to be doing quite well, not just in terms of exports, but even in terms of domestic demand. So that narrative has shifted. So the question is, how can we come to an agreement where the two sides can, in a sense, declare victory without bending the knee to each other?
Yeah.
It's going to be a very difficult process, but I think it's very good that we have discussions at the technical, policy, and leadership levels. That gives me hope.
When we talk about the Chinese economy, how much we should really jump out of this slope of only China-US, but more diversified opinions and perspective to see the real picture? Professor Jin.
If we describe the world commonly as politicized, polarized, and protectionist, I'd say along with what you have laid out, the world pragmatism is still very much true and reigns true for the vast majority of the world. And economic pragmatism still, I think, is the core guiding principle. There is an absolute illusion of de-risking and decoupling, even among the two big major superpowers, US and China. I hear that all the time, but that's not what the data suggests. In terms of the direct trade and investment, yes, it has gone down between the two countries. But guess what? They are more embedded with each other indirectly than ever before. The countries that the US has been importing more, the four largest countries that have seen the greatest growth, actually happen to be the four economies that China is exporting more to. We're seeing that it's just a realignment of trade, a reorganization of trade. Chinese exports have gone from labor-intensive final goods to critical intermediate goods and parts exports. And US imports still has so much embodied Chinese parts. That doesn't go away. Yes, you're talking about economic fragmentation, geopolitical risk, and that is, truthfully, an order of magnitude higher than it was before in the 1970s, and uncertainty. But the reality is that economic interlinkages are still there. But as you were mentioning, I think we're moving really towards a recalibration of globalization, a lot led by regionalism, a lot led by regional production chains, supply chains, technology, and multilateralism is still around. It's probably taking a different shape and form, but geopolitics, while important, still is, guiding, still is the umbrella under which the economic collaboration is still there.
Yeah.
We observed all the geopolitical risk in the front, very volatile, but at the bottom of the core economy, it's really the dependency define the whole situation.
Absolutely.
So it's very interesting. Let me give you a number. If we go back to Trump 1.0 in 2018, Trump launched 301 against China, which is really out of blue. At that time, China exports roughly $500 billion to the United States, import $200 billion from the United States, and they have a $300 billion surplus. You know how much is today? Today, China continues to export $500 billion to the United States and import $200 billion from the United States, and they have a $300 billion surplus from the United States. That's to show, number one, the competitiveness of Chinese company. The second two, the dependency between the two economies. We need each other, so we trade and remain, right? So I think understand the fundamental economic strengths and dependency in these two huge economies. I think it's absolutely important. So when we see the geopolitical risk volatility, we see the shock uncertainties, but we do have confidence on ourselves.
Ms. Kadri, what is the temperature that the business community is feeling, especially from where your field, chemical industry, sometimes create news stories, by the way, these days. So how is that angle helping you to look at the Chinese economy today?
Yeah. Well, what we feel is the only certainty is uncertainty. Frankly, I've been 30 years in the chemical industry, 10 years as a CEO for listed companies. And it's very rare that, we wake up in the morning and we look at tariffs and then we start modeling what's the impact on our businesses and supply chain. China is the chemical hub, industrial hub of the world. 50% of the chemical output in the world is coming from China. It's going to be 2/3 of the output by 2030. And in my 30 years in experience in the industry, China went from copying or imitation to now producing new champions in the chemical industry. And these are our customers, be it in electrification, the BYD, the CATL of the world, be it in lightweight materials like Comac in aviation, those are my customers as well, be it in connectivity, Xiaomi and others, right? So China is now, when you look at the EV, the LFP lithium-ion battery is the #1 lower total cost of ownership, battery material in the world. And actually I invited Chinese players to come and invest in Europe because that's the best available technology. So while it's not easy the short term and navigating through the tariffs, right? And I hope there is light in the tunnel and there are conversations between the two, countries. Frankly, even in Q1, GDP China grew 5%. They are still exporting and there is diversion of output, specifically in the chemical industry, into Europe. I was pleased to hear Premier Li and the government actually launching a consumption-led economy, domestic one in China, which is extremely important to address the capacity issues. But frankly, in the chemical industry, there are bright days through innovation and innovation-led economy, and China is going to become a champion in that in our industry.
All right, Mr. Guy, I know you have a lot to say when it comes to business community.
I think once upon a time, the world was very simple, right? I focus on making the best product at the best price available and innovate, and the world would take my product. These days, the world is a lot more complicated, right? As Premier Li said yesterday. And I think it's very interesting as to how the Chinese company has kind of moved on, right? The US is not the majority of the market, right? And there's actually a lot of trade corridors that's been emerging. So the most busy flight these days to Riyadh, right, to Dubai, right? ASEAN has been the biggest trade partner with China in the last few years. China LATAM is another trade corridor that's actually growing very quickly. So as I think Chinese companies, that were once the proud factory of the world, is now becoming kind of multinationals going into the world, right? And they're really playing around, how do I play into the, the politics, into the local communities? How do I become much more of a corporate citizen of the world? And I think you see that transition.
Trade, geopolitics, consumption, and innovation all influence China's economy. Policies, investments, industries, and financial dynamics form the intricate layers of this ever-evolving landscape. At China's Economy Analyzed, a key session at this year's Summer Davos, you will gain invaluable insights from industry practitioners and straight-shooting perspectives that keep you ahead of the curve.
The next China is actually still a lot of China.
Ones that are most protected from trade wars and geopolitical uncertainties are those that have their own IP, R&D, skill, upstream.
To make sure that both the short term and the long term look promising.
I'm bullish about China. I think it's a new era for new champions.
I think the fundamental is China is going to lead AR plus wave, not only for China, but for the whole world.
Join me for an in-depth discussion about the Chinese economy and be part of this global conversation on an ever-changing world. Mr. Guy, I still want to ask you about that, Joe. You earlier only touched on Chinese companies, but I also want to know global companies here in China or with China. How does that work?
I think for multinationals, what's going on right now has affected them in a very big way, right? I do think that whether you're a US company or whether you're a European company, and remember, multinationals not only US and Europe, right? There are also many other multinational companies around. But I do think that for them, as they look at this world, it has become a lot more complicated. Remember that the Chinese supply chain is a match in many different segments, right? So as we found, there are many different segments where China is like 80% or 90%, right, of actually the world supply. So for them, I think that this has become a little bit of a, yes, China plus one, but China plus one also means that China is still very, very important. And I think that in the last few years, I think that most multinationals started off with, well, let's find the plan B. But the plan B ended up having China being a pretty big component of the plan B. A lot of people are trying to say, well, let's build over here. But you know what? The equipment comes from China, the raw materials come from China, the supply chain comes from China, and then everything else. So for multinationals, it has been a little bit of a rejuggling of this, some diversification, but ultimately, it's hard to completely diversify away.
Once again, there is a narrative. The narrative is everybody's leaving and this and that. I'm not trying to do a propaganda session, by the way, here. I'm just trying to hear, people really on the ground, what they are facing with and what the reality is so that we have more real evidence before we go to any conclusion. So, Ilham, tell me more about how do you see what Joe just mentioned?
So, in China, we've been in China since the 80s. And China, and I think you said this very well, this is not the end of globalization. This is an evolution. That's how I see it for my company. Second, when we learned in China, when you are in China, you rather learn how to compete. It's tough, not only for foreign companies. So competition is part of the DNA here. Even my employees.
Tell me more about it. I'm sure a lot of audience
are fast competing with the rest of our employees. And by the way, they win most of the time. So it's not the point. You rather be on your toes. You rather ensure now that innovation is happening. So we learned in the past years how to live in China. So two perspectives. One, inside China, I truly believe that there will be more onshoring, right? Most of the companies, and now we're in my head as the president of the Global Chemical Association, are looking at what to onshore and how to onshore it. So we need stable environments, which China is giving us. We need protection of IP, which have been, really progressing well, and we need more of this. We need financing, and the Chinese banks are extremely strong these days. I was talking in the lounge, that we may be even raising bonds in China. The second piece is outside China, and I talked about the new Chinese champions who are going to invest. It may not be in the US because it's not popular these days for China to invest in the US, but it can be in Europe, in Latin. You talked about this. So I invited my dear customers in electrification, to come to Europe and bring their best available technology and bring those resilient value chain into Europe. And this is an opportunity for Chinese transplants, but for Europe, who is struggling, by the way, to bring, the best available technology to fulfill its Green Deal, type of ambitions.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Jin, Keyu, can you help us to understand since, the symbolic existence of DeepSeek as a opening of open source in AI field, it seems a lot of the logic of competition and cooperation has changed. So how is that already changed the logic? Help us to understand the realities and the potential of the Chinese economy.
I think that DeepSeek is only the beginning of a massive wave of scale-based, cost-reductive, leading-edge innovation, where China has a unique advantage of combining both leading-edge technology and massive productive capability and scale all in one manufacturing capacity. But we have to realize that even if the US could be the leader in inventions and breakthroughs, production and diffusion of technology is just as, if not more important, for the benefit of the economy. And if you look at China's recent AI Plus program, which is trying to push AI into every plausible sector, robotics, that kind of combination, the digital economy really at the frontier of the world, almost accounting for 10% of GDP. This is kind of all-inspiring. There's a little bit of a discrepancy, and I think there's kind of a dichotomy here in China, the Chinese economy, both between this huge technological dynamism that we've seen, maybe thanks to the U.S. Controls, export controls, and the economic softness, as well as the dichotomy between the macro, which can, let's say, reach 5% GDP target, and the micro sustained confidence issues. It is a dichotomy, but we've seen is that I just want to say that technological breakthroughs often happen in times of crisis, not in times of comfort.
Yeah. There's an urgency, and there's the change. Aswar?
So DeepSeek has certainly shifted the narrative, and one thing that is clear to me, having come to the winter Davoses frequently, is that relative to last year, the sense of confidence that I get, I don't mingle with the Chinese masses, but policymakers that I speak to, businessmen I speak to, there is a definite shift. It's DeepSeek, the meeting that President Xi Jinping had with entrepreneurs, which seems to have shifted the balance between the state and the private enterprises, with the notion that private enterprises are once again back in favor. Now, the question is whether this moment, which I think is potentially a very promising one for China, because as Professor Jin pointed out, China is very good at scaling up these innovations and in terms of diffusing them in a way that you can get very good productivity growth, which really has to be the answer for China with declining demographics and so on. In the US, what is interesting is that in the last few quarters, we've actually seen productivity doing quite well. We don't quite know if it is an AI effect, but it seems like that is a plausible interpretation. And if China wants to rely on productivity growth, that is certainly a potential answer. Yeah. Now, the question is whether the rest of the economy, especially the financial system, is going to be set up in a way that you can channel resources to take advantage of that. And that, I think, is where this moment is really important, because on the surface, everything looks calm. But the question is whether this moment is being used to push forward these deeper structural reforms or to pull back from them because things look calm on the surface. And that, I think, is the real issue at this juncture for the Chinese government.
This is not about just the Chinese economy. It is also about the rest of the world. From scaling law earlier about pumping in as much money as possible and only a few monopoly, to everybody now can jump onto the wagon. Maybe opening source is still a bit lag behind the closed source in terms of the best of technologies, but it is close. So it means everybody can actually have a say or have a possibility. So, Min, as a result of that, what could that mean for the synergy among economies?
I think we're going to see huge impact from AR to whole economy, because it's not easy to use open AI, too expensive and too big, and you have to surrender all your data to the open AI centers. You feel uncomfortable. Yeah. So when DeepSeek emerges, you have I call it an AR plus with the open resource. I think it's really changed the whole things. I imagine with the huge pool of engineers China has today, with all the massive rich scenario China has in industry, in the next 24 months, I imagine to see 100 DeepSeek type of software were emerging. And also good news is when DeepSeek emerging on the software, now we have Huawei produce the servers, which is good enough to support a DeepSeek software. And China have a data policy roughly 18 months ago called the Data 20th, and allow the data to be an asset, to be a resource to use by all the company. And this year, Chinese authorities encourage local government to public all the local public data for private company to use in the productions. So I see a big wave for AR plus is coming. So they will have a huge impact on the whole economy, and not only on the computing science.
Right. Before talking about the Gen AI, let me give you an example. In the battery business, we know very well, half of the cost on an EV car just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was the battery. Half of the cost was not affordable to many. Now it's single digits, and it's getting lower and lower because we could, with innovation, build smaller batteries, higher energy density, more driving distance, less driving angst, and this is affordable. And while Tesla put a battery on a wheel, many Chinese OEMs now and customers are reimagining the car. We have developments with NIO here where they have interchangeable batteries. So you don't buy your battery, you lease it.
Right.
Coming to Gen AI is fascinating. I wish I'm younger. 35 years ago when I did my PhD in chemistry, I would use Gen AI applied to my science.
So how is that,
Gen AI,
how is that related to the economy?
The industry and the economy. Anywhere for our corporation, we believe there will be 20 to 30% less full-time equivalents in many of our departments, be it ITIS, global business services, etc., communication, marketing, etc. Gen AI is fascinating. I'm a digital immigrant, so I'm learning, as my age, relearning actually these things. But what is amazing is that out of unstructured data, it makes sense out of it. And it helps us without building, a massive infrastructure to use it to have well-educated decisions. Okay. So we are applying it everywhere. Mm-hmm. The biggest potential is in our research and development, because here we are, your notebook becomes digital, become available to everyone in the world. And you can cut your innovation times, which can go up to 2, 3, 4 years in the chemical industry, down to 6 months. Right. And this is amazing.
If I could ask a favor from you, 10 seconds if you can, give a conclusion in your perspective, our topic today, China's economy analyzed. Go from you as well.
It's a promising time, and the key question is whether the government will keep its eye on the long term, because there are many deeper issues that need to be resolved to make sure that both the short term and the long term look promising.
I think the great stuff will go very far, but we got to watch out for the disparity, right, and the equality on this.
Present challenges and future opportunities.
I'm bullish about China. I think it's a new era for new champions and structuring the old and building an efficient, innovative, disruptive new.
Like that.
I think we are currently in a very volatile and a changing world. Yeah. So don't always look into the past, but look into the future and breathe the future. It will be a wonderful future.
I'm thinking about that jazz song already. But thank you. With that note, we're coming to the end of this session, China's Economy Analyzed. I want to thank our panelists for being so cooperative and innovative. When we say China's economy analyzed, this is not the conclusion. This is an ongoing process, and we are all contributing to that process. So thank you so much for all your attention and participation. Appreciate it. Thank you.